Hidden beneath the glittering facade of Britain's monarchy lies a dynasty whose influence reshaped the modern world, the House of Hanover. From the day George I crossed the Channel in 1714 until Queen Victoria's death in 1901, this German-born line steered the British Empire through seismic events. The American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the explosive rise of industrial power. Yet their public glory masked private dramas. A fortune now valued at $1 to $2 billion grew from crown lands, colonial commerce, and early factory investments, even as whispers of George III's madness, palace love triangles, and backroom political plots echoed through St. James's corridors. In this video, we pull back the velvet curtain to expose those secrets, how Hanoverian monarchs bankrolled global expansion while battling scandal, why cultural showpieces like the British Museum and Kew Gardens were more than displays of prestige, and how the dynasty's bloodlines quietly threaded across Europe to keep royal power alive long after Victoria. Join us for a deep dive into Hanoverian intrigue, British monarchy scandals, and hidden royal history, a story of wealth, war, and enduring influence that proves even the most dazzling crowns cast shadows. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss a revelation. From new money to old money, picture the scene. A crisp London morning, horse-drawn carriages rattling across cobblestones, traders hollering on the Thames, and all eyes fixed on a newly arrived German prince who barely speaks English. That young elector, George of Hanover, is about to place Britain under a foreign crown and flip the island's social hierarchy on its head. His family fortune, stacked high with revenues from well-run German estates, looks impressive. But to the entrenched English aristocracy, it screams new money. A whiff of the frontier hustle that banker William Brickell rode to fame across the Atlantic. Yet within a single century, the very same cash pile will be treated as venerable old wealth, as permanent a fixture as Stonehenge. How did the House of Hanover pull off that metamorphosis? The story that follows is a roller coaster of political chess moves, daring marriages, visionary patronage, colonial windfalls, industrial bets, scandals worthy of tabloid headlines, and enough real estate to make even Manhattan's titans blush. We start in 1701, when the Act of Settlement rewrote Britain's succession rulebook to keep a Catholic off the throne. In one stroke, Parliament vaulted the Hanoverians to pole position, and just as crucially, gave them a legitimacy boost no amount of money could buy. Think of it as the English answer to the Habsburgs' intricate imperial paperwork, only this time the ink secured London, not Vienna. By 1714, Queen Anne was dead without an heir, and George I crossed the Channel to take the crown. Overnight, his German fortune became royal British wealth, but courtiers still whispered that his assets were upstart capital from the continent, nothing like the stately estates surrounding Blenheim or Chatsworth. George knew he needed to convert new money gloss into old money gravitas, and he had a simple plan: consolidate power, flaunt culture, and anchor the dynasty in bricks, mortar, and marriage alliances so sturdy no gossip could shake them. Power consolidation came first. George I held regular cabinet meetings, an innovation at the time, turning loose gatherings into something we would recognize as a government in session. These sessions boosted ministerial clout, yet also tethered Parliament more closely to the crown. It was a delicate dance, but the payoff was vast. Royal prerogative appeared constitutionally grounded, and Hanover wealth began to look less like a German import and more like an English institution. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the far-flung domains of the Habsburgs reminded everyone how sprawling dynastic reach could legitimize a ruling house. George rode that comparison like a seasoned diplomat. "See," his courtiers would mutter, "if Vienna can manage half of Europe, surely London can tolerate one careful German." Cultural patronage soon followed, spearheaded by George III, the grandson instantly recognizable to modern audiences as the Mad King of American Revolution lore. Long before any breakdown, George III grasped that founding institutions could cement a family name far more durably than coin. Thus, in 1753, from his father's private library and a world-spanning trove of artifacts, he midwifed the British Museum. If Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney would later wield art to lock her last name into New York's DNA, George III got there first, a gallery of empire under a single roof, proclaiming Hanoverian sophistication to citizens and skeptics alike. A century later, Queen Victoria and her consort Albert doubled down on cultural fireworks with the Royal Albert Hall and the broader South Kensington Albertopolis complex. Each stone laid was another claim that the dynasty's riches were no fleeting wave of cash, but the deep tide of national identity. Marriage sealed the deal. When Victoria wed Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840, the match looked like the perfect dynastic duet, German bloodlines twined with British rule, a cross-border alliance echoing Aristotle Onassis's much later quest to splice shipping wealth into the Kennedy mystique. Although the public hailed the royal love story, court insiders recognized a shrewder subtext. Albert carried continental connections, modern ideals, and German organizational rigor that slotted neatly into Victoria's empire-wide aspirations. Their union pulled scattered German principalities closer to the British orbit, much as Onassis's marriage pulled Greek shipping clout into America's Camelot glamour. Every glittering court ball and every royal christening broadcast the message that Hanover fortunes were intertwined with Europe's broader political architecture. But sheer glamour could not pay every bill. For that, the Hanoverians leaned heavily on colonial cash, and no engine spewed profits faster than the East India Company. While newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst would strike gold quite literally, in his mining ventures a century later, the company was already funneling bullion, spices, textiles, and later opium proceeds into Britain's treasury. Caribbean sugar plantations added more zeros to the Hanoverian ledger, worked by enslaved Africans whose stolen labor turned royal dividends sweet. By the late 18th century, the crown's indirect take from global commerce made the family fortune look less like the revenue of landed gentry and more like the balance sheet of a modern multinational. That mountain of silver financed wars against Napoleon and bankrolled infrastructure at home, tightening the dynasty's grip on power. Yet wealth alone could not quarantine scandal, and the Hanover dynasty hosted enough drama to keep pamphleteers busy for decades. George III's mental health crises, now believed to involve porphyria or bipolar episodes, burst into full public view during the 1788 Regency crisis. Pamphlets portrayed him as unfit, ministers debated a regency, and cartoons lampooned the Mad King. His suffering became the Hanoverian equivalent of Edward Doheny's teapot dome headache, a personal ailment that morphed into a public legitimacy problem. Add to that George IV's gambling, rumors of secret marriages, and William IV's illegitimate children, and you have a recipe for palace intrigue hotter than any Netflix script. Each scandal threatened to yank the family back into the new money gutter, reinforcing whispers that German upstarts lacked the moral polish of England's older peerage. So the Hanoverians did what savvy families always do. They invested. Railways crisscrossed Britain under royal charters, each iron rail a stake in the future of industrial power. Factories whirred from Manchester to Birmingham, throwing off dividends that dwarfed the income of many aristocratic estates. The Crown's private purse picked up shares in canals, docks, and insurance companies, all discreetly managed so that royal hands looked clean even while profits rolled in. Think of these moves as the 19th century equivalent of a tech-savvy billionaire buying into AI startups before the boom. The gambles paid off. By Victoria's high noon, Hanover money, though born in German soil, ran through nearly every pipeline of Britain's industrial might. Of course, bricks and mortar remained the visible symbols of lasting supremacy. Buckingham Palace, bought by George III and expanded by George IV, transformed from a private townhouse into a symbol recognized worldwide. Windsor Castle, an older Norman stronghold, became the weekend seat of the monarchy after sweeping renovations. Crown lands stretched in every direction, hunting estates in Sandringham, vast acreage in Balmoral, urban parcels peppered across London. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who scattered their Gilded Age inheritance on Newport cottages, only to watch most of them slip away, the Hanoverians folded their property portfolio into the Crown estate. That clever legal wrapper insulated assets from individual mismanagement, ensuring each reigning sovereign could enjoy the perks without the peril of personal bankruptcy. Meanwhile, cultural projects kept sprouting. Victoria digitized the royal brand further by endorsing the expansion of Kew Gardens, turning it into a living catalog of imperial botany. In tropical hothouses and orderly arboretums, plants from every colony rooted beneath glass, a silent triumph of empire and science. The message was unmistakable. The Hanoverians not only owned half the map, they also curated nature itself. Millennia earlier, Egyptian pharaohs had etched their names into obelisks. The House of Hanover planted saplings that would outlive them, then labeled each species with neat copper tags. If Andrew Mellon's Trust later preserved American masterpieces for public eyes, Kew and the British Museum did the same for everything from Assyrian friezes to Amazonian orchids, each object a testament to Hanoverian largesse channeling private fortune into public wonder. So the ledger of Hanover assets by the dawn of the 20th century looked like this: prime crown lands anchored by Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, soaring colonial revenues first mined by the East India Company and Caribbean Sugar, industrial stakes running the gamut from iron rails to insurance pools, and cultural jewels such as the British Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, and Kew Gardens. Every category bristled with historical parallels: Brickell's frontier hustle, Whitney's curatorial flair, Onassis's marriage calculus, Hearst's commodity windfalls, Doheny's reputation pitfalls, Vanderbilt extravagance, and Mellon prudence. Yet through all these echoes, the dynasty preserved a singular advantage: continuity. In 1901, Queen Victoria breathed her last, and the baton passed smoothly to her son, Edward VII, ushering in the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, soon rebranded as the Windsors during World War I, when German names became awkward. The estates, investments, and cultural foundations transferred intact. Where the Vanderbilts hemorrhaged their fortune through internecine spending, the Hanover legacy simply changed its calling card and marched on. George III's secret madness cover-up. In December 1788, the grand halls of St. James's Palace echoed with the midnight chime of a clock, signaling the depth of a cold winter night. Beyond the glow of candlelit corridors, a crisis was unfolding that threatened the stability of Great Britain. King George III, the third Hanoverian monarch, was in the grip of a severe mental and physical collapse. His symptoms were alarming. He rambled incoherently, screamed at unseen figures, and suffered from sleeplessness, abdominal pain, and discolored urine. His normally composed blue eyes were bloodshot, and his behavior erratic, swinging between manic energy and despair. Servants moved cautiously, and physicians whispered in guarded tones, aware that any leak of the king's condition could spark panic across London and beyond. This was not a fleeting illness, but the beginning of a decades-long struggle with what modern medicine identifies as porphyria, a hereditary metabolic disorder that disrupts the nervous system, causing hallucinations, psychosis, and excruciating pain. Between 1788 and his death in 1820, George III endured multiple episodes of this debilitating condition, each one challenging the monarchy's ability to maintain authority in a turbulent era. The Hanoverian court, led by Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, orchestrated an extraordinary campaign to conceal the severity and hereditary nature of the king's illness, shielding the public from the truth to preserve national stability. This account explores the medical, political, and social dimensions of George III's crisis, the court's secretive response, and the lasting impact on Britain's monarchy and public perception. George III's symptoms, meticulously recorded by his physicians, paint a vivid picture of a man in torment. During his first major episode in 1788, he spoke incessantly, sometimes for hours, mixing prayers with nonsensical references to angels or events that existed only in his mind. His urine was noted to be blue or purple, a striking clue that baffled doctors at the time. He suffered from severe abdominal pain, sensitivity to light, and muscle weakness, often pacing restlessly or collapsing in exhaustion. These episodes were not constant. Periods of lucidity alternated with bouts of delirium, making the king's condition unpredictable. Today, medical historians and geneticists attribute these symptoms to acute intermittent porphyria, a rare disorder caused by a genetic mutation that disrupts the production of heme, a component of hemoglobin. When triggered by factors like stress, fasting, or certain medications, porphyria can cause a buildup of toxic substances in the body, leading to neurological and physical symptoms. In George III's case, potential triggers included the intense pressures of monarchy, personal losses, such as the death of his children, and possibly the use of medicines containing heavy metals, which were common in 18th century treatments. The hereditary nature of porphyria was particularly troubling for the Hanoverian dynasty. Records from the royal archives suggest that several of George's relatives in Germany, including his grandfather and possibly other collateral branches, exhibited similar neurological symptoms. This pattern raised fears that the condition could afflict future monarchs, threatening the dynasty's legitimacy. Yet, in the 18th century, the science of genetics was non-existent, and physicians lacked a clear framework to diagnose or treat such a condition. Instead, they relied on crude interventions like bloodletting, blistering, applying hot plasters to the skin to draw out illness, and emetics to induce vomiting, believing these might balance the body's humors. These treatments often worsened the king's condition, exacerbating his pain and confusion. The timing of George III's illness could not have been worse. In 1788, Britain was reeling from the loss of its American colonies in the Revolutionary War, a blow to national pride and economic power. Across the Channel, the French Revolution was brewing, with radical ideas of republicanism threatening monarchies everywhere. By the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte's rise added a military dimension to these ideological threats, as France's ambitions challenged British dominance. A visibly incapacitated king risked undermining confidence in the government, spooking investors, and emboldening foreign adversaries who might exploit Britain's vulnerability. Within the government, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, only in his late 20s, faced a delicate balancing act. Pitt understood that the monarchy was not just a symbol, but a linchpin of Britain's constitutional system. If Parliament or the public learned the full extent of George's condition, especially its potential to recur or pass to his heirs, it could trigger calls for a permanent regency, destabilizing the government and Pitt's own leadership. The opposition, led by figures like Charles James Fox, was eager to install George's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, as regent, hoping to shift power to their faction. Pitt, however, distrusted the prince, whose extravagant lifestyle, gambling debts, and political alliances threatened to disrupt the government's agenda. To manage the crisis, Pitt imposed a strict information blackout. Royal physicians were instructed to avoid specific diagnoses in their reports, referring to the king's condition as indisposition or intermittent fever. Correspondence between Pitt and the medical team, preserved in the Royal Archives, reveals a coded language designed to obscure the truth. References to hereditary patterns were redacted, and symptoms like blue urine were buried in technical jargon or Latin phrases like urina caerulea. Pitt's strategy was to project stability, even if it meant deceiving Parliament and the public. This approach was not without precedent. Earlier monarchs, like Henry VIII, had their ailments downplayed, but the scale and sophistication of the cover-up under George III were unprecedented, driven by the era's growing media landscape and public scrutiny. The Hanoverian court's efforts to conceal George III's illness were a masterclass in crisis management, blending secrecy, propaganda, and strategic timing. In the early months of 1788, as the king's condition worsened, courtiers restricted access to the palace, limiting who could witness his behavior. Servants were sworn to silence, and physicians worked in shifts to monitor the king around the clock, documenting his symptoms in private logs that were heavily edited before being shared with ministers. When the king showed signs of improvement, as he did by January 1789, the court seized the opportunity to stage a public recovery. Newspapers loyal to the government published engravings of George walking in the palace gardens, dressed in a heavy coat to mask his frailty, with captions praising his resilience. Public celebrations followed, with church bells ringing and crowds cheering, unaware of the fragile truth. Behind the scenes, the court braced for future episodes. The Prince of Wales, frustrated by his limited role and eager to assume power, pressed Pitt for a regency bill that would grant him control over the crown's finances and government appointments. Pitt resisted, knowing that a regency would undermine his premiership and potentially destabilize the government. To delay action, he commissioned additional medical opinions, circulated vague updates about the king's health, and leaned on loyal MPs to stall parliamentary debates. This delicate dance continued for over 2 decades, with each new episode of the king's illness prompting fresh efforts to maintain the illusion of royal competence. By 1811, the king's condition had deteriorated irreversibly. Now blind, partially deaf, and frequently delusional, George III could no longer function as monarch. Parliament finally passed the Regency Act, installing the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent, but with significant restrictions to limit his authority. The act was a compromise, reflecting Pitt's earlier strategy of preserving the monarchy's symbolic power while minimizing disruption. Even then, the court continued to manage public perception, issuing statements that emphasized the king's temporary incapacity and avoided any mention of a hereditary condition. While the court focused on political survival, the royal family bore the emotional and psychological brunt of the crisis. Queen Charlotte, George's devoted wife, was a pillar of strength, maintaining a calm facade while privately grappling with fear and exhaustion. She insisted on personally overseeing the king's care, serving his meals, and sitting by his side during his worst moments. Contemporary accounts describe her anguish as she watched her husband pace barefoot on cold floors, muttering about lost siblings or imagined prisoners he believed he must free. Charlotte's own health suffered, and by the time of her death in 1818, she was described as physically and emotionally depleted. The king's children also faced profound challenges. The Prince of Wales, later George IV, used his father's illness to advance his own ambitions, hosting lavish parties and cultivating a public image as a cultured, capable leader. Yet his actions masked a deeper tension. His father's condition forced him to confront the possibility of inheriting the same affliction, a fear that may have fueled his reckless behavior. The king's daughters, meanwhile, faced a different fate. Several remained unmarried into middle age, as potential suitors hesitated to align with a family tainted by rumors of hereditary illness. The stigma of the royal malady cast a long shadow, isolating the princesses and limiting their prospects. For George III himself, the experience was one of profound suffering. Palace diaries reveal moments of heartbreaking clarity, such as when he read Shakespeare aloud with perfect diction, only to lapse into delirium hours later. In his worst moments, he was restrained to prevent self-harm, a practice that horrified his family but was standard for the time. His physicians, bound by loyalty and secrecy, faced their own moral dilemmas, knowing their treatments were often ineffective or harmful, yet unable to speak openly about the king's condition. Despite the court's efforts, information about George III's illness inevitably leaked, fueling speculation and satire. London's burgeoning print culture, with its newspapers, pamphlets, and caricatures, amplified every rumor. Satirists like James Gilray depicted the king as a bumbling farmer conversing with trees, while radical pamphleteers in France and Britain portrayed him as a deranged tyrant unfit to rule. One popular pamphlet, The Farmer King's False Harvest, 1795, sold 20,000 copies in weeks, alleging that courtiers silenced the king to maintain their own power. These portrayals, though exaggerated, tapped into a public hunger for truth in an era of limited transparency. George IV's secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. On a rainy December night in 1785, London's bustling streets were quiet, the cobblestones slick with moisture, and the air heavy with the chill of winter. In a discreet Mayfair townhouse, a small group gathered in secrecy, their actions poised to challenge the foundations of the British monarchy. At the center was George Augustus Frederick, the Prince of Wales, heir to the throne and future King George IV. In his hand was a diamond ring, and in his heart a determination to marry Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic woman, in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. This law, enacted by his father, King George III, forbade royals from marrying without the sovereign's consent, rendering any union with a Catholic not only void, but politically explosive. The ceremony, conducted in Maria's drawing room by a reluctant Anglican clergyman, was a bold act of rebellion against legal, religious, and dynastic constraints. For George, it was a testament to a love that transcended his role as heir. For Maria, it was a leap of faith, binding her to a man whose position made their union a constitutional crisis in waiting. The marriage was kept secret, its existence guarded by a small circle of loyal confidants. yet it shaped the lives of both George and Maria for decades. This account explores the origins of their relationship, the clandestine wedding, the intricate web of concealment, and the enduring legacy of a love that defied a kingdom. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 was a cornerstone of Hanoverian control over the royal family's alliances. Enacted by George III after his brothers made scandalous matches, the law required any descendant of George II to obtain the monarch's approval for marriage. Without it, the union was legally invalid, and any children born of it were illegitimate, barred from the line of succession. The act was particularly stringent regarding Catholics, reflecting deep-seated Protestant fears rooted in England's history of religious conflict. The 16th century reign of Mary I, known as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, and the 1605 Gunpowder Plot, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate James III, lingered in the public imagination. In 1785, Catholicism was still seen as a threat to Britain's Protestant identity, and a royal marriage to a Catholic was unthinkable. For the Prince of Wales, the act was not just a legal hurdle, but a personal affront. At 23, George was a charismatic but impulsive figure, known for his extravagant lifestyle, gambling debts, and penchant for romantic entanglements. His father, George III, viewed him as reckless, and their relationship was strained by the king's strict moral code and the prince's defiance. The act symbolized George III's attempt to rein in his heir, but it also set the stage for a dramatic clash between duty and desire. Maria Fitzherbert was no ordinary romantic interest. Born Maria Smythe in 1756, she was 29 when she met George, 6 years his senior, twice widowed, first to Edward Weld in 1775, who died months later, and then to Thomas Fitzherbert in 1781, who left her a comfortable fortune. She carried herself with a quiet dignity shaped by loss. As a devout Catholic, Maria was deeply principled, refusing to become a royal mistress, a role that would have compromised her faith and exposed her to the fickleness of court life. Her resilience and independence made her stand out in a society where women's status often depended on male patronage. Maria's return to London in 1783 after a period of mourning caught the attention of the city's elite. She was described as serene, with expressive brown eyes and a composed demeanor that contrasted with the flamboyance of the prince's usual circle. Her Catholic faith, while a social liability in Protestant England, was central to her identity, influencing her decisions throughout her relationship with George. When the prince began his ardent pursuit, Maria was cautious, aware of the risks of entangling her life with a royal whose promises might not withstand political pressures. George first encountered Maria at a London opera in 1783, an event that marked the beginning of an intense obsession. At 21, he was captivated by her poise and maturity, qualities that set her apart from the younger, less experienced women he typically courted. His letters from this period, preserved in the Royal Archives, reveal a depth of emotion rare for a man known for fleeting infatuations. He wrote of Maria as "my angel," confessing that her image haunted his residence at Carlton House and that he would sacrifice anything for her affection. These declarations, though theatrical, reflected a genuine attachment that would endure for decades. Maria, however, was skeptical. Having navigated 2 marriages and the loss of both husbands, she understood the fragility of security and the dangers of aligning with a prince whose debts and political entanglements were public knowledge. George's initial overtures were met with polite refusals, as Maria insisted on a relationship grounded in mutual commitment rather than casual dalliance. His persistence escalated, reportedly including threats of self-harm, when she hesitated, a tactic that revealed both his desperation and his emotional volatility. Ultimately, Maria agreed to marry him, but only on her terms, a formal marriage recognized by her Catholic faith even if it violated English law. The marriage took place on December 15th, 1785, in the intimate setting of Maria's Mayfair drawing room. The ceremony was a carefully orchestrated secret, attended by a handful of trusted friends and witnesses. Reverend Robert Burt, an Anglican clergyman, officiated despite the legal risks, reportedly swayed by his belief in the couple's sincerity. A small fireplace provided the only light, casting a warm glow over the scene as George and Maria exchanged vows. George presented Maria with a diamond ring and a simple gold band, symbols of their commitment. The marriage register, signed by both, was a dangerous document, its existence a potential weapon in the hands of political opponents. The event was a bold defiance of the Royal Marriages Act, which rendered the marriage legally void from the moment it was performed. Yet for George and Maria, the ceremony was binding in the eyes of God, a sacred vow that transcended parliamentary statutes. Maria's Catholic faith gave the union a spiritual weight, while George's willingness to risk his future as heir underscored his devotion. The secrecy of the wedding was paramount, as any public knowledge could ignite a constitutional crisis, inflame anti-Catholic sentiment, and jeopardize George's claim to the throne. The marriage's survival depended on absolute discretion. George ordered all participants to maintain silence, and Maria burned many of his letters to prevent their discovery, though she preserved a few in a locked strongbox as proof of their union. The couple developed elaborate strategies to maintain their relationship while avoiding scrutiny. When George traveled, his footmen carried 2 sets of correspondence, official dispatches for ministers and private notes for Maria, hidden to evade prying eyes. At public events like the theater, Maria sat in a separate box, but their glances across the crowd conveyed a shared secret. Court gossip was inevitable, as London's coffee houses and salons thrived on speculation about the prince's private life. Yet the lack of concrete evidence kept rumors at bay. George's political allies, aware of the marriage's potential to disrupt alliances, worked to suppress any discussion of it in Parliament or the press. Cabinet ministers used euphemisms like the lady or the bond in their correspondence, avoiding direct references to Maria. This meticulous concealment mirrored other historical cover-ups, such as the hushed annulment of Lucrezia Borgia's first marriage in the 15th century, where Vatican intrigue obscured the truth to protect dynastic interests. To further complicate matters, George sought a private annulment months after the wedding, likely to shield Maria from legal repercussions should the marriage be exposed. The details of this annulment are murky, with no surviving paperwork to clarify its form or legitimacy. References in royal household correspondence to the prince's renunciation suggest a formal attempt to nullify the marriage on paper, but emotionally, George and Maria remained bound. The annulment, if it existed, was a pragmatic gesture, not a rejection of their commitment. The surviving letters and documents related to George and Maria, known as the Fitzherbert Papers, offer a poignant glimpse into their relationship. Housed in the royal archives at Windsor and private collections, these records include George's passionate letters, Maria's measured responses, and inventories of personal tokens they exchanged, such as a miniature portrait, a lock of hair, and a cracked rosary bead. Maria's correspondence reveals her strength and resignation, as in one letter from 1787, "My dearest friend, the weight grows heavy, yet I shall bear it while I breathe." These artifacts humanize a story often overshadowed by its political implications, highlighting the personal cost of their secret life. The papers also underscore the challenges of maintaining a clandestine relationship under intense scrutiny. Maria's decision to preserve certain letters, despite the risk, suggests her determination to protect the truth of their marriage. George's gifts and notes, filled with playful and heartfelt sentiments, reveal a side of the prince rarely seen in public accounts, which often portrayed him as a self-indulgent dandy. Together, these documents paint a picture of a couple navigating love in the face of insurmountable obstacles. By 1795, George's financial and political situation had become untenable. His debts, estimated at £630,000, threatened to bankrupt him, and Parliament offered to clear them only if he married a Protestant princess. Caroline of Brunswick, a German noblewoman, was chosen as a suitable match, approved by George III. Faced with no viable alternative, George agreed, effectively sidelining Maria. The wedding, held at St. James's Palace in April 1795, was a disaster. George, reportedly intoxicated, stumbled through his vows, and his disdain for Caroline was evident. Within weeks, he returned to Maria, confessing his misery and reaffirming his devotion. The marriage to Caroline produced a daughter, Princess Charlotte, in 1796, securing the line of succession. However, it also deepened the divide between George's public and private lives. While Caroline was his legal wife, Maria remained his true partner, supported by a generous allowance to maintain her household. Maria resisted this arrangement, fearing it resembled payment for silence, but accepted it to ensure her financial security. The triangle of George, Maria, and Caroline became a delicate balancing act, with the prince compartmentalizing his duties as husband and heir while clinging to his bond with Maria. Over the next 3 decades, George and Maria's relationship endured periods of closeness, conflict, and reconciliation. During one estrangement, Maria fled to the continent, prompting George to flood her with letters pleading for her return. In another instance, she barred him from her Richmond villa, forcing him to beg for entry, a scene that humanized the prince as a man humbled by love. A notable reconciliation in 1804 saw them sharing tea and tears, with George kissing Maria's hand in a gesture of renewed devotion. These fluctuations reflected the pressures of their situation. Maria, now in her 40s and later 50s, chose a quieter life, often residing in Brighton to avoid the court's glare. George, as Prince Regent from 1811 and King from 1820, was consumed by public duties and his own excesses, yet he consistently returned to Maria. Their interactions, such as a playful exchange about his extravagant waistcoats, revealed a bond rooted in familiarity and mutual understanding, even as their circumstances grew more complex. When George became Prince Regent in 1811, assuming his father's duties due to George III's mental incapacity, he transformed Carlton House into a lavish center of culture and pleasure. Maria, however, remained on the periphery, visiting only when assured of privacy. Their walks along Brighton shore, away from the opulent Brighton Pavilion, offered moments of respite where they could reflect on their shared past. As king in 1820, George faced the impossibility of acknowledging Maria as queen consort, yet he sought spiritual validation for their marriage. He sent an emissary to Pope Pius VII, requesting confirmation that their union remained sacramentally valid despite its legal annulment. The Vatican's non-committal response allowed George to privately consider himself Maria's husband until his death. The court continued to shield the marriage from public view, Cabinet records from the Regency period used coded language to refer to Maria, and parliamentary debates were steered away from the prince's personal life. The secrecy was so effective that even as George IV's reign was marked by scandal, most notably his attempt to divorce Caroline in 1820, the marriage to Maria remained largely hidden, known only to a select few. George IV's health declined in the 1820s, ravaged by gout, obesity, and opium use. On his deathbed in June 1830, he ensured that a casket of private papers, including proofs of his marriage to Maria, was entrusted to his brother William IV, with instructions to keep it sealed for decades. Legend holds that he clutched a miniature portrait of Maria in his final moments, a testament to her enduring place in his heart. Maria, informed of his death, chose not to attend his funeral, instead praying in her Brighton chapel, her rosary a link to their shared faith. Maria lived until 1837, spending her final years in relative seclusion. She read George's old letters, cherishing one where he predicted historians would view them as lovesick fools, but hoped they would recognize their fidelity. A portrait of her, commissioned by George, hung in her home, its back inscribed with his words, "My wife, the true comfort of my life." These quiet acts of remembrance underscored her role as the steadfast partner in a relationship that defied convention. The full truth of George and Maria's marriage emerged only in the late 19th century, when the strong box entrusted to William IV was opened during Queen Victoria's reign. Inside were the marriage certificate, the gold ring, and sentimental tokens confirming the union's reality. Historians cataloged these findings, cementing Maria's place in the historical record as George IV's secret wife. The discovery sparked renewed interest in their story, though questions about the annulment's details and the Vatican's role remain unanswered, fueling speculation among scholars and novelists alike. The marriage's legacy lies in its defiance of dynastic norms. In an era when royal unions were strategic tools, George and Maria's commitment was a rare act of personal agency, sustained through years of secrecy and sacrifice. Their story parallels other clandestine loves, such as James IV of Scotland's affair with Margaret Drummond, or Henry Flagler's controversial remarriage, where passion clashed with power. It also highlights the human side of monarchy, revealing George IV not as the caricatured Prince of Pleasure, but as a man driven by love to risk his birthright. Victoria's secret affair with John Brown. In the late 1860s, the rugged landscapes of Balmoral, Queen Victoria's Scottish retreat, bore witness to a relationship that would captivate and scandalize Britain. On a misty Highland morning, Victoria, dressed in her customary widow's black, rode out from the castle, accompanied by John Brown, a tall, plain-spoken Scotsman who had risen from gillie, outdoor servant, to her personal attendant. Their closeness, marked by Brown's informal manner and Victoria's evident reliance on him, sparked whispers among courtiers and servants. These murmurs grew into a persistent rumor that the widowed queen, still mourning her beloved Prince Albert, had formed an intimate bond with a commoner, perhaps even a romantic one. The story of Victoria and Brown, shrouded in secrecy and fueled by destroyed diaries and redacted records, became a legend of the Victorian era known as the Queen's servant lover she hid. This account explores the origins of their relationship, the circumstances that made it a source of controversy, the court's efforts to suppress speculation, and the enduring mystery of whether their bond crossed the line from companionship to romance. Drawing on historical records, archival clues, and parallels with other elite cover-ups, It examines how Victoria's court managed a potential scandal and why the story continues to fascinate. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, was a monarch of contradictions. She broke convention by proposing to Prince Albert in 1839, ruled longer than any predecessor, and transformed the monarchy into a symbol of stability during Britain's imperial zenith. Yet her personal life was marked by intense emotions, nowhere more evident than in her grief following Albert's death in 1861. At 42, Victoria plunged into mourning, wearing black for the rest of her life and retreating from public duties. Her prolonged withdrawal alarmed her family and ministers, who feared it weakened the monarchy's public image. Victoria's grief was not just personal, but a public spectacle, as she erected memorials to Albert and insisted on preserving his rooms as shrines. Her court, accustomed to protocol, struggled to accommodate a queen who seemed paralyzed by loss. Into this void stepped John Brown, a servant whose blunt honesty and lack of deference offered Victoria a lifeline. Their relationship, beginning in the mid-1860s, became a focal point for gossip, challenging the era's rigid social hierarchy and raising questions about the boundaries between a queen and her servant. John Brown was born in 1826 at Crathie, near Balmoral, into a family of tenant farmers. Employed as a gillie, he assisted the royal family during their Scottish holidays, guiding them on hunts and rides. His rugged appearance, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes and a thick Scottish accent, contrasted with the polished courtiers of Windsor. Brown's directness, a product of his rural upbringing, set him apart. Where others addressed Victoria as Your Majesty, he reportedly called her woman in private, a familiarity that shocked the court but endeared him to the Queen. Brown's role evolved after Albert's death, when Victoria, seeking solace at Balmoral, relied on him for companionship. By 1865, he was promoted to personal attendant, accompanying her on rides, walks, and private outings. His lack of pretense, joking about tossing sycophants into the river or speaking plainly about court intrigues, brought levity to Victoria's life. For a queen burdened by formality, Brown's candor was a rare comfort, rekindling her laughter and easing her isolation. The closeness between Victoria and Brown did not go unnoticed. At Balmoral, servants observed their unchaperoned rides across the moors, private picnics, and late-night conversations. Courtiers, bound by protocol, were uneasy about Brown's influence, noting his authority over royal security and his presence at Victoria's side during hunts and dinners. The Queen's decision to commission a portrait of Brown, as grand as those of her children, and to grant him the title Esquire in 1872, fueled speculation. These honors, unusual for a servant, suggested a bond that transcended professional duty. The Victorian era prized propriety, particularly for a queen whose moral authority underpinned the monarchy. The idea of Victoria, the widowed mother of the nation, forming an attachment to a commoner was scandalous. Gossip spread from Balmoral to London, where drawing rooms buzzed with innuendo. Satirical magazines like Punch published cartoons depicting Victoria clinging to a kilted giant, while whispers of a Victorian secret hinted at romantic rendezvous. The public, though largely unaware of specifics, caught wind of the rumors, amplifying the story's allure. The court's reaction was swift and secretive. Aware that any hint of impropriety could damage Victoria's reputation, her household took steps to control the narrative. Diary pages that might have detailed her interactions with Brown were destroyed, and letters were redacted or burned. An equerry's order, "To burn it, man, and don't leave ashes fat enough to recognize," encapsulated the urgency of the cover-up. This destruction of evidence, while protecting the queen left gaps that fueled speculation, creating a legend that persists to this day. Despite the court's efforts, fragments of evidence survive, offering tantalizing glimpses into Victoria and Brown's relationship. Balmoral's ledgers note instances of J.B. accompanied Her Majesty after sundown, no ladies in waiting present, unusual for a queen expected to be chaperoned. Supply lists mention blankets for only 2 riders on outings with larger retinues, suggesting private excursions. Receipts for gin supplied to a Mr. B on Victoria's account raise eyebrows, hinting at shared moments of relaxation. These details, preserved in the Royal Archives, are maddeningly incomplete, leaving historians to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. Modern scholars have called for advanced techniques such as infrared scanning or spectral imaging to recover erased or damaged text from Victoria's journals or household records. These methods, inspired by forensic archival work, could potentially reveal hidden details, but no definitive breakthroughs have emerged. The absence of concrete proof, such as an unambiguous love letter or diary entry, keeps the nature of their relationship in the realm of speculation. Yet the circumstantial evidence, from undocumented hours to intimate gestures, suggests a bond that was, at the very least, deeply personal. The central question, whether Victoria and Brown's relationship was romantic or sexual, remains unresolved. Historians agree that Brown was Victoria's closest confidant after Albert's death, a fact documented in her surviving letters and court records. She described him as her best friend, and, after his death in 1883, wrote that her heart was broken. She kept a lock of his hair, commissioned a statue of him at Balmoral, and placed his photograph beside Albert's on her bedside table. These actions reflect a profound attachment, but whether it crossed into physical intimacy is speculative. Several clues fuel the possibility of a romantic affair. Witnesses, including a stable lad, reported Brown's hand resting on Victoria's waist as he helped her dismount, a gesture deemed overly familiar. An army lieutenant overheard Brown call her "my lass" before correcting himself. Victoria's gifts to Brown, including engraved jewelry, and her insistence on his presence during private moments suggest a level of trust and affection unusual for a queen and servant. The destruction of diaries and letters, particularly those from the 1860s and 1870s, implies the court feared compromising content, though what that content was remains unknown. However, the lack of direct evidence, such as explicit correspondence or contemporary testimony, prevents a definitive conclusion. Victoria's devotion to Albert's memory, her public image as a virtuous widow, and the era's strict moral codes make a sexual affair seem improbable to some scholars. Others argue that her emotional dependence on Brown, combined with her defiance of convention, makes it plausible. The truth likely lies in a gray area, a relationship that was deeply emotional, possibly flirtatious, but not necessarily physical. The Victorian court's handling of the Brown rumors was a masterclass in reputation management. By destroying or redacting records, the household ensured that no damning evidence reached the public. When gossip surfaced, courtiers dismissed it as vulgar speculation, emphasizing Victoria's loyalty to Albert. Public appearances were carefully staged to project dignity, with Brown relegated to the background in official settings. The monarchy's ability to weather the storm contrasted with other royal scandals, such as Tsarina Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin in early 20th century Russia, where similar rumors of intimacy with a low-born confidant fueled revolutionary unrest. The parallel with Alexandra is striking. Both women, widowed and isolated, turned to outsiders for comfort, blurring the line between loyalty and impropriety. In Russia, the failure to suppress rumors about Rasputin contributed to the Romanov dynasty's collapse. In Britain, Victoria's court employed discretion and destruction to protect the Queen's image, a strategy that proved effective. The monarchy emerged unscathed, its authority intact, demonstrating the power of controlled narratives in an era of growing public scrutiny. The Victoria Brown saga fits into a broader pattern of elite efforts to conceal personal relationships. In the early 20th century, rumors swirled about Juliana Force, the first director of the Whitney Museum, and her close friendship with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Official records were sanitized, leaving only whispers of a bond that may have crossed professional lines. Similarly, the House of Grimaldi faced speculation about Grace Kelly's overseas friendships, discreetly documented to avoid scandal. These cases illustrate how powerful figures, from monarchs to magnates, manage private lives under public scrutiny, often by erasing or obscuring the evidence. The destruction of records in Victoria's case echoes these efforts. By removing diary pages and redacting letters, her court created a firewall of plausible deniability, a tactic still used by modern institutions to deflect controversy. The parallels highlight a timeless challenge, balancing personal desires with public expectations, particularly when those desires threaten established hierarchies. Victoria's family was less forgiving of her relationship with Brown. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, openly despised him, referring to him as the brute and resenting his influence over the Queen. Princess Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, urged her mother to observe proprieties, a plea complicated by Beatrice's later role in editing Victoria's journals, which some historians believe included censoring references to Brown. These familial tensions underscored the broader discomfort with Brown's elevated status, which challenged the rigid class distinctions of the Victorian court. When Brown died in 1883 at age 56, reportedly from erysipelas, Victoria's grief was profound. She wrote of her loss in private letters, sealed some with black wax, and erected a bronze statue of Brown at Balmoral, facing the hills they had explored together. Her actions, while heartfelt, intensified speculation, as did the discovery after her death in 1901 of Brown's photograph beside Albert's on her bedside table. These tokens, surviving the court's purges, became enduring symbols of their bond. George I's secret imprisonment of Sophia Dorothea. In the summer of 1694, the Lanischloss Palace in Hanover was a fortress of secrets, its corridors hushed as a crisis unfolded behind closed doors. Elector George Louis, the future King George I of Great Britain, faced a devastating betrayal. His wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, was allegedly planning to flee with her lover Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a dashing Swedish cavalry officer. The discovery of their affair, documented in smuggled letters, threatened the stability of the House of Hanover, a dynasty poised to inherit the British throne. George acted decisively, ensuring Königsmarck's disappearance and Sophia Dorothea's lifelong imprisonment in the remote Alden house. The affair was buried under a veil of silence, its details obscured by destroyed records and official denials. Yet it remains one of the most enduring scandals of the early Hanoverian era. This account explores the origins of Sophia Dorothea and Königsmarck's relationship, the events leading to their downfall, the brutal consequences they faced, and the meticulous cover-up orchestrated by the Hanoverian court. Drawing on archival evidence, historical parallels, and the lingering questions that fuel modern speculation, it reveals how a personal tragedy became a dynastic crisis, shaping the Hanoverian legacy for generations. Sophia Dorothea of Celle, born in 1666, was the daughter of the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg-Schelle, a prosperous but minor German duchy. Her marriage to George Louis of Hanover in 1682 at age 16 was a strategic alliance designed to unite two branches of the Brunswick-Lüneburg family and strengthen Hanover's position in the complex web of European politics. Sophia Dorothea brought a substantial dowry of 100,000 thalers, while George, heir to the electorate of Hanover, offered prestige and a connection to the English throne through his mother Sophia of the Palatinate, a granddaughter of James III. On the surface, the match seemed promising. Sophia Dorothea was described as beautiful, witty, and spirited, with a passion for music and literature. George, 4 years her senior, was reserved but ambitious, focused on securing his family's assent. However, their personalities clashed from the start. Sophia Dorothea found George cold and uncommunicative, while he viewed her vivacity as unbecoming. Their relationship deteriorated rapidly, marked by separate living quarters, public spats, and mutual resentment. By the late 1680s, the marriage was a hollow shell, producing 2 children, George Augustus, future George II, and Sophia Dorothea the younger, but little affection. Into this strained marriage stepped Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman and military officer whose arrival in Hanover around 1690 ignited a dangerous spark. Born in 1665, Königsmarck was tall, charismatic, and battle-tested, having fought against the Ottomans in the Great Turkish War. His charm, honed in European courts, made him a favorite among the nobility. At the Hanoverian court, he captivated Sophia Dorothea with his wit, gallantry, and shared interests in dancing and poetry. Their relationship began innocently, with flirtations at court functions, but soon deepened into a passionate affair. Over 2 years, they exchanged hundreds of letters, smuggled through trusted intermediaries, that revealed their growing devotion. These letters, some of which survive in fragments, are filled with romantic pledges and plans for escape, including sketches of border routes where they might flee to safety. Königsmarck's reckless affection and Sophia Dorothea's longing for freedom fueled their dreams, but their correspondence was a ticking time bomb, monitored by Hanover's vigilant spy masters. On a moonless night in July 1694, the Lena Schloss became the stage for a swift and brutal resolution. A letter from Wolfenbüttel, warning of Sophia Dorothea's plan to elope with Königsmarck, reached George Louis, who acted with calculated precision. Königsmarck was summoned to the palace under the guise of urgent business, only to vanish without a trace. Historical accounts differ on his fate. Some claim he was ambushed by guards, stabbed, and his body disposed of in the Lena River or burned in the palace ovens. Others suggest he was secretly imprisoned or exiled. No official record of his death exists, and no body was ever found, leaving his disappearance one of history's enduring mysteries. The Hanoverian court's silence was immediate and absolute. No inquest was held, no public statement issued. Guard rosters from July 1694, preserved in the Lena Schloss archives, show 4 names redacted, possibly indicating the men involved in Königsmarck's removal. A letter from Sophia Charlotte of Hanover, George's sister, cryptically refers to our late Swedish friend taking an unexpected sea voyage, a likely euphemism for his demise. The absence of concrete evidence, such as a weapon, body, or confession, has fueled speculation, but the probability of murder, ordered or sanctioned by George, remains high. George's response to Sophia Dorothea was equally ruthless. Accusing her of malicious desertion of marital duty, a catch-all charge implying adultery and disloyalty, he annulled their marriage in 1694, stripping her of her title as Electoral Princess. Rather than exile or public trial, which might have exposed the scandal, George confined her to Alden House, a moated mansion in the remote Lüneburg Heath. This decision ensured her isolation while maintaining the appearance of leniency. She was not executed or stripped of all privileges, but her life became a gilded cage. At Alden, Sophia Dorothea was cut off from the world. She was forbidden from seeing her children, George Augustus and Sophia Dorothea the Younger, who were raised in Hanover without contact. Visitors required multiple approvals, and her letters were intercepted, copied, or destroyed. Guards patrolled the estate, and local residents were warned against aiding her. Her allowance, documented in Hanoverian court minutes as für die frühere Herzogin, for the former duchess, provided for comforts like harpsichords and books, but was tightly controlled to prevent escape or communication. For 32 years, until her death in 1726, Sophia Dorothea remained a prisoner, her existence erased from public view. Sophia Dorothea's decades at Alden were marked by monotony and quiet defiance. She paced the mansion's oak-paneled corridors, read French tragedies by Racine, and tended a small rose garden. Her passion for music found expression in playing the harpsichord, though her isolation limited her repertoire. Housekeeping ledgers from Sale Castle note provisions for Alden, including lamp oil, woolens, and musical instruments, painting a picture of a life sustained but constrained. A 1702 entry records her fainting during a Christmas Eve service, overwhelmed by a choirboy's voice that echoed Königsmarck's, a rare glimpse of her enduring grief. Sophia Dorothea wrote petitions to figures like the Holy Roman Emperor and the English Parliament, pleading for release, but these were routinely mislaid or ignored, deemed contrary to diplomatic interests. A 1700 report mentions a disturbance by the barn, possibly an escape attempt involving a bribed stable hand, and a 1710 letter to Louis XIV of France sought diplomatic intervention to no avail. These efforts, documented in Alden's guest ledgers, reveal her determination to reclaim her freedom, even as hope faded. The Hanoverian court's handling of the scandal was a masterclass in damage control, reflecting a dynastic instinct to protect reputation at all costs. By erasing Königsmarck's fate and confining Sophia Dorothea, George ensured the affair remained a private matter, shielding the family's claim to the English throne, which they assumed in 1714 under the Act of Settlement. Court records were sanitized, with redactions obscuring key details, and public discussion was suppressed. In England, George I banned pamphlets about Sophia Dorothea's imprisonment, fining or jailing offending printers. A pamphleteer, John Freake, attempted to publish the lament of a Hanoverian princess, but was silenced after one stanza, fleeing to Amsterdam, where his work failed to gain traction. This secrecy mirrored historical precedents. The Plantagenet mystery of the princes in the Tower disappeared in the 1480s to secure Richard III's crown, and the Habsburg confinement of Joanna of Castile, labeled mad and imprisoned by her father, reflect similar strategies: eliminate threats, control narratives, and let time obscure the truth. The Hanoverians' efficiency in this regard set a template for later royal cover-ups, from George III's hidden Porphyria to George IV's secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. George's actions were not merely personal, but political. In 1694, the House of Hanover was a rising power, its claim to the English throne contingent on maintaining alliances and legitimacy. An adulterous wife risked destabilizing marriage negotiations, particularly with Prussia, where Sophia Dorothea's daughter was later wed. More critically, rumors of illegitimacy could have undermined the succession, as George Augustus, The future George II was a direct heir to both Hanover and Britain. By imprisoning Sophia Dorothea, George neutralized the threat of scandal, ensuring the dynasty's credibility at a pivotal moment. This ruthless pragmatism was rooted in the era's political realities. Dynasties like the Habsburgs and Bourbons routinely sidelined inconvenient relatives to preserve power, and George's decision aligned with this tradition. His pride may have been wounded, but his primary motive was to safeguard the Hanoverian brand, a calculation that proved successful when he ascended as George I in 1714, with no public outcry over Sophia Dorothea's fate. Sophia Dorothea's life at Ahlden ended in November 1726, after a brief fever at age 60. Her death was handled with the same secrecy as her imprisonment. Hanover forbade a public funeral, and her coffin was transported by night to Shell Cathedral, buried without royal honors under a simple plaque reading S.D. von Ahlden, born Duchess of Brunswick-Lüneburg. The lack of ceremony underscored her erasure from the Hanoverian narrative, a final act of control by George I, who outlived her by 8 months, dying in 1727. Her children, George II and Sophia Dorothea the Younger, thrived in their respective roles, unaware of or indifferent to their mother's plight. Whether Sophia Dorothea knew of Königsmarck's fate or resented her children's silence remains unknown, as her diary and most personal writings were lost or destroyed. The few surviving records, such as the 1702 ledger entry, suggest a woman haunted by loss but resilient in her solitude. Hanoverian secret slave trade profits. In the late 1760s, London's bustling docks were a hub of imperial commerce, with barrels of sugar, rum, and cotton arriving from the Caribbean, unloaded by dockhands under the watchful eyes of clerks. These goods, the lifeblood of Britain's global trade, masked a darker truth. A portion of their profits flowed directly into the personal coffers of King George III and the Hanoverian monarchy. Through a web of discreet investments, shell companies, and coded ledger entries, the Crown reaped substantial wealth from West Indian plantations reliant on enslaved labor, carefully disguised as colonial revenue. This financial maneuvering funded naval expansion, colonial fortifications, and royal luxuries, all while maintaining an image of fiscal propriety. This account explores how the Hanoverians profited from the slave trade, the mechanisms used to conceal these gains, their impact on Britain's imperial ambitions, and the ethical questions that linger today. By the mid-18th century, Britain's economy was deeply entwined with its Caribbean colonies, particularly Jamaica, Barbados, and Grenada. These islands produced vast quantities of sugar, coffee, and cotton, commodities that fueled wealth across the empire. The labor behind these goods came from enslaved Africans, subjected to brutal conditions on plantations. The slave trade, formalized through the triangular trade system, saw British ships transport goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and plantation products back to Europe. This system generated immense profits, shared among merchants, ship owners, insurers, and investors, including, discreetly, the monarchy. King George III, reigning from 1760 to 1820, presided over this era of imperial expansion. The Hanoverian dynasty, which began with George I in 1714, inherited a throne tied to Britain's growing global dominance. While public accounts emphasize the monarchy's income from customs duties, excise taxes, and crown estates in Hanover, a hidden stream of revenue from Caribbean plantations bolstered the royal purse. These funds, obscured by euphemisms and financial sleight of hand, allowed the Crown to finance projects that shaped Britain's empire, all while distancing itself from the moral stain of slavery. The Hanoverian monarchy's involvement in the slave trade was not direct ownership of plantations, but rather investments in enterprises that profited from enslaved labor. Treasury memoranda from the 1760s and 1770s reveal entries labeled miscellaneous colonial receipts, which spiked in correlation with bumper sugar harvests or rising coffee prices in Jamaica. These entries, buried in dense ledgers, represented dividends from shares held by royal trustees in Caribbean estates, often masked by shell entities like the Consolidated Colonial Improvement Fund. This euphemistic title concealed the reality. The funds derived from plantations where enslaved people toiled under horrific conditions. The financial trail was further obscured through the East India Company, a powerful institution with close ties to the Crown. Ledgers from the company include entries marked Crown Guarantee, superficially appearing as insurance for cargo against piracy or storms. However, tracing the signatures reveals a more complex scheme. Profits from West Indian plantations were funneled into a slush fund, used to purchase company bonds, which then paid dividends back to the Crown, disguised as interest from unrelated investments. By the time these funds reached the privy purse, they appeared clean, detached from their origins in slave labor. This practice of financial obfuscation was not unique to the Hanoverians. In the 17th century, the Duchy of Savoy used similar tactics, cloaking profits from illicit Mediterranean trade under terms like extraordinary port dues. The Hanoverians refined this approach, leveraging Britain's vast colonial network to create a sophisticated system of laundering that preserved the monarchy's reputation while maximizing its wealth. Evidence of the Crown's involvement survives in scattered but compelling archival records. The India Office records in London contain a 1774 balance sheet noting a capital subscription, Crown, £72,000, coinciding with the sale of 3 Jamaican estates orchestrated by royal trustees. Cash books in the Royal Archives from 1777 list received sundry sums per West Indian accounts, entered on days when sugar prices peaked in Kingston. A 1788 letter between the Lord Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England references West India script maturing under Consolidated Fund B, later linked to a Grenada plantation ledger listing bank script, royal interest, code B. These documents, though cryptic, form a clear pattern when cross-referenced with customs rolls and commodity market data. A marginal note from a whistleblowing clerk, scribbled in faded ink as "Plantation Money Hush," adds a human dimension to the cover-up. Treasury manuals instructed clerks to aggregate CL-REV entries without breaking them down by property, ensuring auditors saw only lump sums. When a junior official questioned this, the response was curt: state policy prohibits further dissection. These directives, preserved in the National Archives at Kew, reveal a deliberate effort to obscure the monarchy's ties to slavery. The scale of these profits is staggering. Over 3 decades, transfers from colonial sources likely exceeded several million pounds, a fortune that offset wartime deficits, funded colonial garrisons, and supported royal extravagances. The correlation between Caribbean commodity booms and royal disbursements, such as for naval upgrades or colonial settlements, suggests a system too consistent to be accidental. The hidden wealth from slave-based plantations fueled Britain's imperial ambitions in tangible ways. The Royal Navy, critical to maintaining Britain's global dominance, benefited significantly. In the 1760s and 1770s, colonial revenue funded copper sheathing for ship hulls, new frigates for Caribbean patrols, and provisions to combat scurvy. These investments strengthened Britain's naval supremacy, enabling victories like Trafalgar in 1805, ironically fought with resources partly derived from the very system abolitionists later sought to dismantle. The Board of Ordnance also drew on these funds to construct forts along Canada's St. Lawrence River. Lawrence River and stock powder magazines in Sierra Leone, bolstering Britain's defenses against French and Spanish rivals. The settlement of Australia in the 1780s, including the first fleet to Port Jackson, was partly financed by a surge in plantation profits following a French crop failure. These expenditures, documented in Admiralty and Ordnance records, highlight how slave-derived wealth underpinned Britain's ability to project power across continents. The irony is stark. Enslaved labor in the Caribbean helped fund the infrastructure of an empire that later championed abolition. By the early 19th century, Britain's naval patrols off West Africa, aimed at suppressing the slave trade, were partially paid for by profits from the same trade decades earlier. This contradiction underscores the moral complexity of the Hanoverian financial system. The lack of contemporary public outcry can be attributed to several factors. First, libel laws deterred newspapers from directly accusing the monarchy, with printers facing fines or imprisonment for seditious content. Second, many MPs were themselves investors in the slave trade, giving them little incentive to probe royal finances. Firebrands like Charles James Fox, who criticized royal overreach, lacked access to the locked ledgers held in royal residences or East India Company vaults. These documents, guarded by loyal officials, were inaccessible to all but the inner circle, many of whom dined with cabinet members and shared their interests. The press, while vibrant, faced economic pressures. Abolitionist editors who hinted at royal complicity saw their funding dry up as advertisers and patrons withdrew support. The era's Enlightenment ideals of reason and transparency were often subordinated to financial and political realities, ensuring that the monarchy's involvement remained a whispered suspicion rather than a public scandal. The Hanoverian profits were not the work of a lone monarch, but a collaborative effort involving a broad network of actors. Lloyd's of London insured slave ships, artisans crafted chains, investors purchased plantation-linked annuities, and consumers bought sugar produced by enslaved labor. This collective complicity embedded slavery in Britain's economy, making the monarchy's role just one part of a larger machine. However, the Crown's position at the apex of power amplified its moral responsibility. By profiting from slavery while maintaining an image of virtue, the Hanoverians set a precedent for elite hypocrisy, complicating the efforts of abolitionists like William Wilberforce, who faced resistance from a commons intertwined with the slave economy. The Hanoverians were not alone in masking exploitative profits. The Duchy of Savoy's 17th century trade in illicit goods, disguised as maritime levies, and the Hohenzollern dynasty's 19th century profits from African colonies, labeled imperial modernization grants, reflect similar strategies. These parallels highlight a recurring tactic among elites: reframe morally dubious earnings as legitimate revenue to preserve public trust. The Hanoverians' use of shell companies and coded entries anticipated modern corporate practices, where profits from controversial sources are laundered through complex financial structures. A closer parallel is Warren Delano, the 19th century American merchant, whose opium trade profits were reinvested in Manhattan real estate, distancing his family, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, from their origins. Like Delano, the Hanoverians transformed tainted wealth into symbols of prestige, from Georgian palaces to coronation regalia, ensuring their legacy appeared untarnished. The British slave trade was abolished in 1807, but slavery in the colonies persisted until 1834, when the Slavery Abolition Act emancipated enslaved people in the British Empire. Plantation owners received substantial compensation funded by taxpayers for their losses, and some claims bear abbreviations linked to the same shell entities used by royal trustees decades earlier. This suggests the monarchy may have profited twice, first from plantation dividends, then from emancipation payouts. The continuity of these financial mechanisms underscores the enduring benefits accrued by the crown from its earlier investments. The story of the Hanoverian monarchy's profits from the slave trade is one of calculated concealment and imperial ambition. Through coded ledgers, shell companies, and strategic silences, George III and his court transformed the suffering of enslaved Africans into wealth that fueled Britain's rise as a global power. From naval frigates to Australian settlements, the fruits of this system shaped the empire. Yet the monarchy's involvement was carefully hidden, preserving its image of propriety. The evidence scattered across archives paints a clear picture. The crown was a silent partner in the slave economy, reaping millions in profits while distancing itself from the moral implications. Historical parallels from Savoy to Prussia, and modern comparisons like Warren Delano's opium wealth, highlight a timeless pattern of elite profiteering. As historians and the public continue to probe this legacy, the call for transparency grows louder, urging a full accounting of how yesterday's exploitation continues to echo in today's institutions. The barrels rolling onto London's quays in the 1760s carried more than sugar. They carried the weight of human lives, converted into gold for a king. That truth, once buried in ledgers, now demands recognition, reminding us that an empire's glory is inseparable from the hands that paid for it. By confronting this history, we honor the resilience of those who suffered and challenged the narratives that have too long obscured their story.